Good morning. I'm appreciative of this, and I could take my mask off, but I can't remember if I brushed my teeth this morning. So I'm going to leave this on and, do unto others. So there we go. I don't remember exactly when this happened, but I distinctly remember that it did happen. Pete was absolutely ecstatic when he found out that he shares a name with another famous person named Peter Parker. In a sense, ever since Peter realized that he has, to one degree or another, always identified with Spider-Man. Usually when we play superheroes, even if he's wearing a Captain America shirt and has Captain America's shield, he is usually Spider-Man when we play superheroes. He identifies with Spider-Man. Regularly, he tells me, when I talk to him about spelling his name, and he's learning to recognize his name when he sees it written out, and he'll remind me, Daddy, you know who else is named Peter? And I know it's coming, but I always prompt him, like, who, buddy? Tell me. Spider-Man. To be fair, though, I always identified with Spider-Man, too. At least when I was a little bit older than him and was able to watch the Spider-Man cartoon, I identified with Peter Parker, or Spider-Man, for a number of reasons. He was kind of nerdy. That was me. He was kind of nerdy. He wasn't always able to get a date very easily. Guilty. That was me. And the show also presented him as the kind of thoughtful person that sort of carried on this inner monologue whenever he was struggling between doing the thing that he wanted to do versus doing the thing that he ought to do. And honestly, that's a struggle that every Christian should be able to appreciate as well. I always saw myself in the hero, right? I always saw myself in Spider-Man, the hero. And never once when I was growing up watching these cartoons with superheroes and villains, never once did I identify with the villain. That is, until I watched Spider-Man Homecoming that came out in 2017. Like I said, this was released just a few years ago, and in the world of the story, it takes place a few years after a major battle in the city of New York, when the Avengers had to fight off an invading alien army. They won that battle, but parts of the cities are in ruin, and so, in Spider-Man Homecoming, Michael Keaton's character and his crew are called in to clean up the debris. They win the contract, and they get this job. He runs a small business. And so to tackle such a big job like this, he has to buy a whole fleet of trucks, and they have just begun working. They've just begun working when the feds show up and tell him, nope, we'll take it from here. Y'all can't do this anymore. Michael Keaton's character is justifiably upset. He tries to plead with the person who comes there to tell them, no, y'all can't do this anymore. And it's like, look, I've got a crew, I've got family, I bought trucks for this job. And I say, no, I'm sorry. None of that counts. That leaves him and his crew and his family without any means to support themselves. Michael Keaton's character is the little guy who gets edged out, cheated, and legally can't do anything about it. He is justifiably ticked off, and you can't help but feel bad for the guy. This was totally out of his control. But then something interesting happens. It just so happens that there's one small pickup truck load left of alien weapons and technology that the feds miss, that Michael Keaton's character hides. He gets an idea. Fast forward a few years later into the story, and we find that Michael Keaton's character has adopted an alter ego, a villain by the name of the Vulture. He has used what was left of that alien tech and weapons to sell on the black market, and to steal other weapons and technology. And he builds actually a pretty nice life for himself. And in the world of the story, though, you are supposed to feel some sympathy for this guy, at least initially. But gradually, in his desperation, he makes increasingly destructive decisions, resorting to theft, arms dealing, and at one point in the movie, even murder. This was a regular guy who made a series of costly decisions. It's easy for us, the audience members, who are paying attention, to be at least a little sympathetic here before he turned to a life of being a villain. And again, like I reiterated, that I wouldn't condone any of what he did, not for a moment. But if I'm being totally honest with myself, this story of a regular guy who becomes a supervillain, this story scares me a little bit. At the beginning of the story, he was a normal, everyday kind of person, somebody that the audience can identify with. And let what's on the screen sink into you for a little bit. The villain here is somebody that you can see yourself in, I think, if you're paying attention to the story. He's a parent who wants to provide for his family. So at least I can understand the motivation behind that. And because I can understand that motivation, I think that's what honestly scares me here. I can see myself in this villain. I'm not used to watching movies that way, right? When was the last time you sat down and watched a movie, pick any kind of movie you like where there are clear good guys and bad guys, and you thought, I identify more with the bad guys here. I've never wanted world domination. I've never wanted revenge on someone so bad I was willing to kill them. I've never wanted something so bad I was willing to steal it. So like I said, I'm not used to watching movies that way. And you know what else? I'm definitely not used to reading the Bible that way. Ask yourself honestly. We were talking about movies just a minute ago. Let's shift over to the Bible. When was the last time you read the story of the Exodus and you saw yourself as an Egyptian rather than a Hebrew? When was the last time you saw yourself as an Egyptian? Or how about this? Have you ever thought about the likelihood that your family would have made it onto the ark? Ouch. Many of us, myself included, we readily identify with somebody like David when he is out standing up for God against the Philistine army and courageously defeats someone who could, in any other circumstance, squash him like a bug. We readily identify with David when he's fighting Goliath. We see ourselves in David, but none of us, quite understandably, would be willing to say that if we were in David's shoes later in life, with all the fame and money and power, that we would betray Uriah to death and take advantage of Bathsheba. Rest assured, I don't think anyone here would do that, okay? I don't think anyone here would do that. But let me suggest to you this, that we have to, in some sense, believe that we could do that. I think we need to believe that we are capable of great sin and horrific evil to understand the true depth of our fallenness, the depth of our sin, so we can realize the true depth of our need for God's grace. Jesus understood our need for God's grace better than anyone. So I'm going to read for you the parable of the unmerciful servant from Matthew chapter 18. And while I'm reading, for just the next few moments, I want you to, maybe for the first time ever, I want you to see yourself as the unmerciful servant. If it causes you to be uncomfortable and squirm a little bit, that's okay for just a few minutes. Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 through 34. Therefore the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Guys, this is Jesus' way of saying he owed his master something like $100 billion. This is an insane amount of money. Jesus is hyperbolizing here. And since he couldn't pay, his master ordered the servant to be sold, with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. Whatever the price that this family and their stuff would have fetched wouldn't be anywhere near 10,000 pounds. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, "Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything." And not because he deserved it, but out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave the debt. But when that same servant went out, okay, this is the servant the same servant who just went out. This is the guy I want you to see yourself in. When that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. It's like 100 days' wages compared to something insane like $100 billion. And he grabbed him and he choked him, saying, "Pay what you owe." And so his fellow servant basically did the same thing. He fell down and pleaded with him, "Have patience with me and I'll pay you." But he refused. And he went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all the debt because you pleaded with me, and should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?" And in anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all the debt. Now, normally, at least for me, whenever I've read this story, I identify with the second servant. I'm indebted to the king, to the master, that's God. But sometimes I also feel like I've been beaten up by others. But I'll tell you this, I'll tell you honestly, in reality, I am just as much the first servant. I am the unmerciful servant. When I beg and plead and cower before those who have power over me, but I threaten and hurt those over whom I have power. If I'm willing to receive anything that I am not on the other hand, or if I'm willing to receive anything that I am on the other hand unwilling to give, that is great evil, selfishness working in my heart. Guys, this is one of the reasons why rage mobs are so foolish. Yes, please, call out genuine injustice, but don't think for a second you wouldn't commit equally egregious injustice. Let's get our own houses in order first before we try to change the world or anybody else. So I say all of this today, not to be a real downer, sorry, it's not a very cheery sermon, but I say all of this today as a way of further introducing our theme for the next several weeks, transformed outreach. It is not impossible, okay? It's not impossible to reach out to people who are different from you to share the gospel. It's not impossible to reach out to people who are different from you to share the gospel. That should be pretty clear, right? Whether someone's male or female, black, white, Latino, Asian, rich, poor, formally educated or not, whatever it is, we can learn how to tell different kinds of people about Jesus. That's one of the beauties of the gospel. That it cuts across all of these lines that some people would like to use to divide us. But I think, at least in my own experience, maybe not in yours, but at least in my experience, I think it's easier and maybe a little bit more effective to share the gospel with people that we can, in some significant way, identify with. And so if I've taken an honest look at myself and realized what evil, what genuine malevolence I'm capable of bringing upon myself and my family and those around me, then my only hope of escaping such evil is death. But not the kind of death that ends life, the kind of death that brings life. I've said it before and I'll say it again. There are many ways of life that lead to death, brothers and sisters, but there's only one way of death that leads to life, and that's in Jesus Christ. If we learn to see ourselves, at least to some degree, if we can learn to see ourselves to some degree in the people we find most loathsome, most difficult to love, the most annoying, or whatever, then we will have come that much farther into embodying the gospel and being like Jesus. Jesus came to earth to save the very people who would kill him, the people who hated him, and even the people that his good Jewish disciples loved to hate, people like tax collectors and sinners. Now, I preached on tax collectors and sinners just a few weeks ago, and I know you all remember exactly what I said then, right? I think there's more we can say about them, at least a little bit. Tax collectors and sinners were those people. And the point I made a few weeks ago was those people, the people that you just write off for whatever reason, maybe a good reason. The people that, by the way you act with them, that it seems like they're not worth your time and efforts, or maybe worth your efforts in sharing the gospel with them. It's the people you wouldn't normally associate with for whatever reason. Sinners were typically the Jewish people who did not always adhere to Jewish customs and norms, and so they drew the ire of the more religious types, like scribes and Pharisees. They could also face some public shame for their lifestyles. Kind of like the first century equivalent of cancel culture, something like that. Tax collectors were even worse, though. The ones who worked for the Romans were considered sellouts and traitors against their people. It wouldn't have mattered if they kept Jewish customs. They were in bed with the enemy and disgrace to their fellow countrymen. But Matthew, the tax collector, would not have automatically been friends with Jesus' other disciples like Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And if you've been watching the Chosen series, you get a little hint of that. I think they do a good job of that. These four almost certainly would have felt like they had good reason to distrust a guy like Matthew precisely because he, to them, was one of those people. But listen to what Jesus says about outward displays of religion. Give us a little bit of context of what Ryan read for us. Matthew chapter 5, verses 10. Matthew chapter 15, verses 10 through 11, and then verses 17 through 20 after that. He called the people to him and said to them, "Hear and understand, it is not what goes into the mouth that really defiles a person." Okay, remember this. Jesus is speaking to a Jewish crowd here, and so they're concerns about eating clean and unclean foods. It's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person. In the ensuing verses, there's some conversation. Peter asks Jesus to explain this. So here's what Jesus says, what Ryan read for us. Don't you see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this is what defiles a person. Out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These things are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands, that doesn't defile anyone. Jesus is wanting them to understand purity a little bit differently. Purity doesn't stop with ritual purity. Purity cuts to the heart. Jesus tells them that if your heart is full of anger, hatred, jealousy, fear, lust, greed, or anything else along these lines, keeping the finer points of the law won't save you. If you think for a moment, Jesus says, that if you're better than those people because you look more religious, I'm afraid that you have become the very thing you hate. Please don't become the thing you hate. Please don't become the thing you hate. The poor and oppressed provide a lens for us to see ourselves, like mirrors for us to see ourselves. What we think about them and how we treat them speaks volumes about our true character. But I think the same can be said for villains also. How we react to the people we do not like may reveal more about ourselves than about them. So for the sake of sharing the gospel, for the sake of letting our outreach be transformed, we must be willing to see ourselves as every bit in need of God's grace and mercy, as the people who anchor us the most. Today's lesson was not a cheery one, I admit, but I think it's a necessary one. It's so easy for us to look on the TV and see people behaving in ways that make them seem more like animals than people. But again, if I'm being honest with myself, I suspect there are probably some things that could push me to do similar things as well, if my family was threatened, at least. If there's anyone here who realizes that maybe you yourself have found yourself in need of an extra measure of God's grace, if anyone here has realized that maybe they are nearing becoming the thing they hate, let me encourage you, while Lee comes up here to lead our invitation song, let me encourage you to either come and ask for prayers, or if you need to be baptized, we're willing to do that too. Would you please stand for the singing of our invitation song, number 767, Who at the Door Stands?